Good morning, boys and girls. Hope you're having a great start to your day. Um, this is Mrs. Engelhardt, and I just wanted to, before we begin, just talk a little bit about what we learned last week in our social studies. So our mini unit is called Search for Freedom, and if you remember from last week, I um, did a lesson on slavery in New York, and Mr. Dorenzo did a lesson on the Civil War. Now, again, both topics could be discussed and um, explored for far more than those 2 days. But we just wanted to give you a sense of that time period and what was happening in America at that time. So we're going to continue that thinking and that learning and spend a little bit of time this week just talking about some influential people during that time because all of the work and all of the progress that our country made didn't happen by accident or by coincidence. So today's lesson is going to be about the abolitionist. So I think before we talk about who those people are, I think I'd like us to just think about this word coming from the word abolish. Okay. And the word abolish is a verb. It means to do away with, put an end to, annul, or make void. And this word is commonly associated with, of course, slavery. But to abolish is an action. And the word abolitionist comes from that word. And something, just a little bit of vocabulary for you. Words typically that end in ist mean one who. So if we were to break that down, we might think of one who abolishes. So an abolitionist is a noun because it's a person, and it's a reformer who favors ending slavery. And a synonym for that would be an emancipationist. And that word comes from, if you remember last week, the Emancipation Proclamation, which was the freeing of slaves. So these are the two individuals we're going to talk about today. Frederick Douglass and William Lloyd Garrison. Okay, these two men had their own journeys and eventually their worlds and their passions converged. And so we're going to talk a little bit about both of them today. So let's talk about Frederick Douglass for a bit. So Frederick Douglass was born into slavery about February 1818. And circa, meaning about, because many times slaves did not even know their birthday. There was no record of their birth. They didn't have a birth certificate. But there is enough documentation that indicates that perhaps he was born in February of 1818. And right away was separated from his mother, never knew his dad, and lived with his grandmother. So eventually he was taken from his grandmother and sent to work as a servant for a slave. And this is the gentleman here. His name was Hugh Auld. He was a shipbuilder. And like many slaves that were brought to other owners, they were given jobs to do. And at a very young age, he had many responsibilities, Frederick Douglass. And then it was his wife, Hugh Auld's wife, named Sophia, who wanted to teach young Frederick how to read and write. And so she does this without her husband knowing. He does eventually find out and stops them from doing that. In fact, reminds his wife that this is against the law and that slaves are not to learn how to read. So, although he was not being taught by Sophia anymore, he already started to have these ideas about what he thought slavery was, what he thought, should happen in the case of it not existing. And so he really believed in human equality and knew that something was not right, knew that he was a part of something much larger that needed to end and change. And so while he was told not to read, he did learn enough and was able to share his passion and determination by teaching other slaves to read. And while his slave owner found this out, he was sent back to a Maryland plantation where unfortunately he was assigned to a slave owner that was not by any means a fair or respectable slave owner. Not that there were really many. If you think of slave owners, you would think that they didn't do a very, it was a very troubling time. But his slave owner was brutal, just a horrible experience for Frederick. And so by 1838, though, he does escape from his slave owner. And he makes his way all the way to New York City. So let's talk about Frederick Douglass as the abolitionist. Now, again, I'm fast forwarding a lot in his life. But when he does get to New York, he eventually finds himself in New Bedford, Massachusetts, where he meets his future wife. And together they speak openly about their feelings for ending slavery, and lives within a free Black community there. And so he begins to speak publicly about his own personal life experiences as slaves, and he gets lots of attention. And one person, in fact, he gets attention of is our other gentleman we're going to speak about today, who is William Lloyd Garrison. Now, at this time, William Lloyd Garrison's already been actively speaking and working towards ending slavery. And so they meet. And one of the things that William Lloyd Garrison does is he encourages Frederick Douglass to do some writing. He was a remarkable speaker, but he also gets him to do some writing. One being the narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass, an American slave, and it's written by himself, and also My Bondage and My Freedom. And finally, Frederick Douglass also begins publishing a paper called The North Star. And what's interesting, of course, the title itself paid homage to the many slaves who used the North Star as a way of direction to freedom. So there's a video we're going to show. I think we're going to watch right now. And let's get this going here.
Oh, great, you finished your autobiography. Wait a minute. You weren't born on a plantation. You didn't escape from here. And you definitely never met Abraham Lincoln. This is just Frederick Douglass's autobiography with his name crossed out and yours written in, isn't it? Sorry, but you're going to have to tell Oprah to pick someone else's memoir. Dear Tim and Moby, we learned about Frederick Douglass in school, but I'd like to know more. From Myron. Sure thing, Myron. Frederick Douglass was one of the most famous American abolitionists of the 19th century. That means he was an opponent of slavery. Douglass was a brilliant speaker, writer, and activist. His words were extra powerful because he'd experienced the horrors of slavery firsthand. Yep, Frederick Douglass was born a slave in Maryland around 1818. He was separated from his mother right after he was born, and he never knew who his father was. He wasn't even allowed to know his own age. As a boy, Douglass suffered from cold and hunger, and he saw friends and family whipped by plantation owners. But he got lucky. Well, as lucky as a slave could get. He was sold to a family in Baltimore that wasn't quite so cruel. The wife even taught Douglass how to read and write, at least until her husband put a stop to it. Back then, it was against the law to teach slaves to read. Slave owners thought that books could give their slaves dangerous ideas about freedom, and in Douglass's case, they were right. Even though he was still a boy, Douglass realized that he could escape from slavery and be free. So he continued his education in secret, planning to flee to the north as soon as he could. Nope, Douglass had to endure years of hardship before he escaped. But in 1838, he disguised himself as a sailor and made it to freedom. He and his wife settled in Massachusetts, where they met a man named William Lloyd Garrison. Garrison was one of the leading abolitionists of the day, and he published a popular anti-slavery newspaper. In 1843, Garrison invited Douglass to speak at an abolitionist meeting. Douglass decided to give it a go. He amazed the crowd with a passionate retelling of his life story. It was such a success that Douglass began lecturing throughout the free parts of the United States. He even traveled abroad and spoke to packed houses in Britain and Ireland. 2 years later, he published his first book, Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass, an American Slave, which is today considered a literary classic. Yeah, I know you've read it. You copied out the whole thing. Anyway, the book became a bestseller in both America and Europe. The first-person prose gave readers a direct experience of Douglass's story. Many had never before considered America's slaves as human beings capable of suffering. Overnight, Douglass became a leading abolitionist spokesman. He began his own anti-slavery newspaper, the North Star. He also supported the brand new women's rights movement and Ireland's right to be free of British rule. That's right, Douglass was friends with Abraham Lincoln. During the Civil War, Douglass called for African American troops to be admitted to the all-white Union Army. When they finally were, he and his sons helped recruit soldiers for the first all-black regiment since the Revolutionary War. But Douglass got angry when he found out they were paid less than whites. So in 1863, he told Lincoln about it personally. It was the first time an African American met with the president at the White House. The two remained in touch for the rest of Lincoln's presidency. Well, after the Civil War, Douglass continued to lecture, write, and publish newspapers. He also held a bunch of official government positions like Marshal of Washington, D.C., and Consul General to the country of Haiti. Well, no, he died in 1895, so I guess he couldn't sue you for copying his book. But you still shouldn't do it. I mean, plagiarism is wrong. Oh boy. Man, they'll publish anything these days.
Okay. So I thought that video gave you a little bit of insight into some other pieces of Frederick Douglass's life that we did not talk about in our slides here today. Let's keep going. So let's talk a little about William Lloyd Garrison. He's mentioned in the video, and I mentioned him earlier as well. But he was a well-known abolitionist in the North. He lived and grew up in Massachusetts. And some of his most famous work would be The Liberator in 1831. He also established the Anti-Slavery Society in that should be 1832. Excuse me, that's a typo. Both his newspaper and his organization, both were all about expressing and getting the message out to encourage and urge people to end slavery, demand slavery to be ended, and truly felt that it was a moral issue, and that it wasn't in the way that obviously he felt strongly that equal rights were meant for all, and that slavery was a worldwide cause, it was not just for America. And of course, since he was so passionate and was so vocal about his message, that he had people that were many supporters that were for him and his message, and many that were against it. And as I said, Douglass and him meet and work together, and William Lloyd Garrison really truly felt that Douglass was sort of his mentee, and felt like he really could encourage him to be the best that he could be as well. So here's another video we're going to watch on William Lloyd Garrison.
William Lloyd Garrison felt that he was destined to do great things, but he had no idea how to get there. In 1828, he was 22 years old, newly arrived in the city from his hometown of Newburyport.
William Lloyd Garrison was an impoverished northerner who lost his parents when he was young, and he came across the issue really by chance, and worked very hard for 30 years, published a paper almost every week by hand himself to fighting against slavery.
The entire narrative of his life is surprising. He was on the outside always. He came from very little, eventually apprenticed to a printing press, and really had a talent for typesetting.
William Lloyd Garrison's argument was always that you had to change hearts and minds, that if you just change the laws, that it's not actually going to change anything fundamentally. And as it turned out, the end of the abolitionist era was they did away with slavery. They changed the laws, but they hadn't changed hearts and minds, really. And what the civil rights era does almost a century later is they change hearts and minds. And I think it will always be a relevant story because what the abolitionists did only 50 years after the birth of the Republic was they held out a vision of a more perfect society.
Dear Mr. Douglass, join me. I urge you. You have a gift. Sir, you really do.
You flatter me.
No, I don't.
Garrison was a mentor for Frederick Douglass and loved him dearly, I think, like a son. And then Frederick Douglass went his own way and came to disagree with some of Garrison's ideas and philosophies, and it was incredibly painful for Garrison. And they had a very public rift and a big argument publicly that was very painful for both of them. And it's this kind of intersection of the political and the personal that I think makes this story so compelling.
The great kind of genius, the simple genius of what Garrison did was that he put himself in someone else's shoes. He saw very early on that there was no difference between any man and himself, that a man was a man. And he took the issue of abolition entirely personally, because he just said, for a second, imagine yourself in the shoes of someone who's enslaved. And it all just kind of was completely simple to him.
Okay. So that's a bit about William Lloyd Garrison. And one of the messages that I think at the very end of that video that speaks to who he was as a person, he was, again, it mentions he was on the outside and really felt very strongly about this effort to end slavery, but that he really was able to put himself in somebody else's shoes. We talk about that a lot, just like Douglass's stories, and I'll go back to our originals, our first slide. Excuse me. Through Frederick Douglass's first-person narrative, helping people who are reading his story to imagine what it was like for a slave, but also that William Garrison was able to do that just within his own personal values and his personal feelings about just human race in general and how people should be treated. So two strong, independent thinking men who really paved the way for even further work. As mentioned in the video, it would be later in the civil rights movement that law and moral conscience come together. But that, abolitionists always had a vision of a more perfect society. And these two men exemplify that message that, there's always more, there's always an opportunity for better, and that everything that out of your own will can make that happen should. So we think about these gentlemen as we continue our work with the Search of Freedom this week, and are grateful for the work that they have certainly done for our history and for